This episode was inspired by a listener who asked me to cover the topic of guilt. Now, as feelings go, guilt is pretty gnarly, and yet so many people live with it day in, day out, and sometimes hold on to guilt for decades. But not all guilt is bad, and today I'll tell you why. I'm going to give you a roadmap for dealing with guilt so you know how to overcome feeling guilty. We'll be looking at it through the lens of good guilt versus bad guilt, the two kinds of guilt. Plus, I'll talk a little on guilt versus shame. Now, fair warning, this episode contains some tough love. But if there's old guilt you've been living with and you want to be free, or if you truly want to know how to navigate guilt going forward, stay with me, buckle up, and let's dive in. Welcome to the Be a Brilliant Human podcast with me, Joel Young. If you're looking to improve your life, to heal, to grow, and mature as an individual, but maybe you found that some of the personal development and consciousness stuff has given you the impression that you need to be super serious and vigilant to get anywhere meaningful, or feeling like maybe you're just not up to snuff, well, this show is here to remind you of your humanity, and in fact that's where your true joy and brilliance lies. With over 25 years of experience in the transformation biz and having developed MPA, one of the world's simplest, pressure-free approaches to growth and well-being, if I do say so myself, I'll be sharing tips, steps, and insights that'll help you navigate all the aspects of life as a growth-seeking being. On this show, it comes to you with a good dose of humour, maybe a smattering of colourful language, a reminder not to take things so personally, and most importantly, to be kind to yourself along the way. Make sure you hit that follow button, and let's get into it. Hello, and welcome to the Be a Brilliant Human podcast with me, Joel Young. I'm delighted that you're here. We are at episode number 111. Which means you can find the show notes if you go to www.beabrillianthuman.com/111. It also means there's 110 previous episodes for you to enjoy, binge listen, and soak up as a backdrop of your Christmas. It'll make you feel good. It'll remind you, as someone said to me, your podcasts reminds me that it's okay to be a fuck up. I love that, because we're human. This is the Be a Brilliant Human show, emphasis on the human. We are all human, and guilt is a topic that seems to be rife in humanity. And some people will say, oh, you have to get rid of guilt, or it's a useless emotion. I disagree. We're going to be talking about that. The fact that I'm even talking about this is thanks to a listener. And if you're a listener, not the one, if you're the listener that actually sent this, Joanna, hi Joanna, here we go. This just goes to show that if you ask me, asking it is given. I love it when listeners ask me to cover a topic. It helps me not have to think, like, what do they want? It helps inspire me with ideas for the show. And it means I know you're out there. You're out there somewhere, listener. So do get in touch. Do let me know. If there's something you'd like me to cover, then just you can do what Joanna did, which is email me. You can email me, joel@nonpersonalawareness.com. You can contact me via the social media platforms. You'll find me on Facebook if you search MPA Rocks. That's November Papa Alpha Rocks. And on Instagram at Joel Young MPA. You can direct message me through there. Leave a comment. Just ask. Ask me. Tell me what you'd like to hear. We're steaming now towards 2022. What would you like me to cover in that year? I'd love to hear from you. So what did Joanna say? Well, Joanna wrote to me and she said, hi Joel, thank you. I always enjoy your podcasts and learn from them in many ways. God bless you. I love that you listen and you learn. That reminds me why I do this every Tuesday, nearly every Tuesday. She goes on, please could we have one on guilt? Easy to say it is bullshit when it's not yours. Less so when you, in brackets I, have carried it for years. Love and light, Joanna. So this one's for you, Joanna, and everybody else who has any experience of guilt which has not been transformed into a wildly positive experience. This one's for you. Now, I said in the intro, there's going to be some tough love. This is going to be a tough love episode. I'm going to be calling you out to some degree. But I do want you to know that as I called you out, I have in my lifetime and career doing this podcast and all the MPA stuff I've done, there are lots of resources, not least of which is those 110 previous episodes. And also, today I'm going to encourage you to go to www.thenpaacademy.com, which is the main hub where you'll find all the resources. And I'll mention them throughout the show. But there's lots of different ways now that you can sort of get support in terms of dealing with guilt. Now, if your guilt is super entrenched and you get the idea from this episode, but you need a hand, yes, go and look at the courses, but also consider reaching out. I do have a little bit of space at the moment in my one-to-one roster. You can check out my sessions if you go to www.joelyoungmpa.com/sessions. Now that's lots of different URLs I've given you, isn't it? They'll all be in the show notes. Go find them. So here's how it's going to go today. We're going to start with a bit of Guilt 101. Get really to the heart of the matter, and I'll talk about the two kinds of guilt. We're going to then start with diving into bad guilt, and then we'll move on to the good stuff, the good guilt. Now, in each case, I'm going to cover how to deal with it, where the sticky bits are, and even how each of them can be twisted, if you like. Well, the good guilt can be twisted to become bad. Interesting that. And actually, even bad guilt can be good. So I'm going to cover it from both angles. As I said in the intro, I'm also going to take a quick look at the difference between guilt and shame, because there's often confusion about the two. And I'm going to wrap this up with, I have to mention the guilt trip. I was raised with a mother who would openly say, that the guilt trip was her main mode of controlling her kids, both at home, and she was a teacher at school as well. So I've got to cover that topic as well. Sound good? Well, let's start with the Guilt 101. Let's dive in. So if you want to get a handle on guilt, you have to boil it down to what it really is. What is guilt? And the answer is surprisingly simple. Guilt is simply a signal. That's all that guilt is. Most emotions, that's the case. They're signals of one or the other. And guilt is one that's a very clear signal. And when you think about it, it's very clear what it's saying. So guilt indicates that a value boundary has been crossed. Yeah. So if you've got a value and that's been crossed either by you, or you've allowed it to be crossed by someone else, any kind of internal value boundary has been crossed, you're going to feel some kind of guilt. So when you get that simple, that inevitably gives you a pretty simple roadmap of how to do it. Now, there are two kinds of guilt. As I said, even in the title, there's good guilt and there's bad guilt. But the reality is that it's not actually guilt itself that's bad, because there's no emotions that are bad. They're just emotions. They're all just some kind of signal. What it is that makes the difference between good guilt and bad guilt is the signal settings that define it. So it's how you have set up the values in your system, and we'll get into how you can use that in a practical sense. That's what makes it good or bad guilt. So here you go. How do you deal with guilt? Well, first of all, you've got to identify the value that's been crossed that's causing the guilt to come up. Then the defining question for whether it's good guilt or bad guilt is, does this value actually serve you? Does it work for you? Is it aligned with you now? Because there are often some old hand-me-down ideas you get, which upon examination don't really serve you anymore. So here's the map. Does the value serve you? Yes. Yes, it does serve me. What I mean by that is it's a value that you currently agree with. You subscribe to that value. It supports you in an empowering way. It's wholesome. It's one that is a good, easy, yes, I like this value. Now, if you cross that and you're feeling guilty, I would call that good guilt. And the short form answer of how you deal with that is take some corrective action. You need to do some repair. You need to put it right in some way. When you've done that, you won't have the guilt because you've put it right. Now, if this value doesn't serve you, in other words, you've looked at it and it's some crappy old hand-me-down one, does it serve you? No. Then you're experiencing bad guilt. And what that means is you're experiencing guilt around something that really isn't true for you anymore. So you need to shift that value. In other words, you have to change the narrative around it. And so the way we deal with good guilt and bad guilt is actually quite different. The bad guilt is about just changing the value or the narrative around it. The good guilt is about taking action. So they're very different paths. Now, today we're really talking about the difference between going from unconscious, an unconscious state around what your values are, where we tend to, I think the technical term is bullshitting ourselves, to being conscious about it. Because what happens is, when things are in unconscious mode, what we do is we set up what is an equivalent of, the police in society. We have the internal value patrol. And all of that does, you can give your inner critic a bad name, but it's like the police. You can give the police a bad name, but they're simply following the laws that have been set. The issue isn't necessarily, and again, let's not get into a big political thing about certain individual behaviours within the police force, because that's the variance of humanity. In every organisation, there's going to be some assholes and some nice people. That's just how life works. Putting that aside, the general principle of the police is they follow the laws. The police's behaviour is based on laws. The issue is to change the laws, right? Or bring it back to our values. It's like changing the values. Your internal police that bring in the sense of guilt and punishment, internal punishment, are following the laws you set. So if you're looking at bad guilt, then the laws are rubbish. You need to change them. You need to change the values. And you know what? I happen to agree that if there are murderers in our society, they should be locked up. That's good guilt. They are guilty. Better off out of society. And hopefully, again, I don't know why I'm getting such a sidetracked by police and our judicial system. Ultimately, the goal would be there. Rehabilitation, genuine rehabilitation. I think our system kind of fails on that. But internally, we can do that. So that's the basis of it. Two kinds of guilt. Good guilt, you need some corrective action. Bad guilt, shift the value. So let's dive into how you do that, starting with bad guilt. So bad guilt is where the value is off. So this takes some kind of inner inquiry, really. You need to ask yourself, is this value working? Now, be aware that one of the ways that we bullshit ourselves is we pretend that these values are okay, they're worthy in some way. So you're going to need some radical honesty here with yourself to really get a sense. But if you genuinely find that the narrative or the value is off, you're going to have to shift that narrative. Now, it just so happens in episode 109, just 2 episodes ago, I did a whole podcast on controlling the narrative, which is really about shifting the narrative. So that's a great thing to go back and listen to if you want to know how to do that. And in fact, many of the different episodes, it's a common topic because it's so important to shift. The stories we tell ourselves about something is generally so impactful on the experience and the behavior that we have and the behaviors that we express. So, but here's the thing, because of that unconscious part, often we'll hold on to guilt, bad guilt, for years because we haven't taken the time to really get clear on where the values aren't working. Now, a lot of people will look at their values or look at what their beliefs and ideas are around the world and what their morals are, and they'll stand up for something that isn't working for them for years. I mean, if you've carried guilt for years about something is off. Now, it may be that it's good guilt. We'll get to that and what may be happening there. But if you discover that it really is based on, you're feeling guilty based on what is fundamentally an idea that doesn't agree with you anymore, then you're going to have to shift that narrative. Now, sometimes just having the realization that it could be your values is enough. You just didn't realize that the guilt was based on that value. Now you see that value is bullshit. And hey presto, it kind of resolves itself. So you might find when you start listening in and going, actually, why am I feeling guilty? What is the story I'm telling myself? And maybe you're hearing, some hand-me-down idea, whether it's come from a teacher or a parent, the usual things. Or it could also be that it's some kind of self-induced survival strategy that's running that tape, running the program. And again, with survival strategies, if you've not heard that term before, it's really often when we're very young and we're not in optimal nurturing conditions, we say. We set up psychological defensive strategies in order to survive, and certainly in extreme cases, but often in many cases, those are a really good idea when you're small and vulnerable and dependent upon the parents and the environment that are there. But what we tend to do is take them into adulthood when they're no longer really valid, because we have more agency in the world, we're freer to move away from toxic people and all that kind of stuff. But often guilt can be based on a story that is sourced from some survival strategy. Now, I'm not saying to you that this is like, oh yeah, click of the fingers, I'm just going to change my values. Here's the thing, it may take work. It can be very easy, and certainly if you're using MPA, it can certainly help. But it's one of those things where you're going to need to get really real and dig about it. If you find the values off, where's it come from? Does it really serve you? If it doesn't, then investigate and explore how you can change it. Now, sometimes, as I say, it's not so straightforward. So one of the things that you might need to face, because if it doesn't just sort of, oh yeah, I get it, that's the story, it's rubbish, I'll change it. If you find that you're starting to go sort of hang on to it, or it doesn't go away, or you can't quite convince yourself, or you get it cognitively but you don't really make the shift internally, you're going to need to face the secondary gains. So secondary gains is where you get something out of it. Now, the surface level argument is, well, of course I don't get anything out of it. Feeling guilty feels terrible. Why would I get something? Well, it's weird, but this is the truth of us wonderful, mad humans. Sometimes chronic guilt can feel weirdly more comfortable than the freedom you say you want. Why? Why would you say that, Joel? Well, because of a bunch of fears. And those fears are stronger, or they suggest more pain than the guilt. The known, this sort of low grade constant guilt is a lot easier than actually, facing the fears. Like, for example, if you do what it takes to come out of that guilt, if you change your values, what will others think of you? Another good episode to listen to is episode 93, because one of the things I see a lot, episode 93 is about feeling responsible versus genuinely caring. A lot of people who have described to me they feel guilty, it's really that confusion around, the sense of feeling responsible for other people versus caring for other people and excluding themselves from the equation of kindness. So it can be one of those things where, and if you suddenly change your values, those people might think, how come she's become so selfish? Why did he suddenly turn into an arsehole? They might have these views. I think I'll just stay guilty and keep going as I am, because that's really scary, because it leads to excommunication, being chucked out of the tribe. I mean, these are very deep fears. So you've got to look at those secondary gains and what the real underlying fears are. Another thing, it's like, I want this freedom, but what if I test my freedom? My freedom theory, I test it and I fail. I've got this limiting story. If I transgress the limiting story, I feel guilty. Better the devil you know, right? So you've really got to be willing to call yourself out. In fact, moving on, that's the hidden positive intent of bad guilt. Remember, it's just a signal. So even that sort of, in quotes, bad guilt, it's a signal that says there's you feel like you're off. Now you have a look and see the values are off. That guilt's going to hang around as a signal to say, do something, change the value, So, I mean, let's turn it on its head. Maybe you just don't feel guilty enough yet, eh? Oh, that's harsh, Joel. Maybe you need to feel more guilt, looking at it from the angle of a signal, to actually, dig deep, face those other fears, because those fears, the secondary gain fears, can be big. So things you can do, which I've talked about in, I go one program where I go deep into this is Boundary Boot Camp, and it is a boundary issue. It's a value boundary issue. We actually go through a process of examining the cost of staying where you are and the benefit of shifting the narrative. There's a whole exercise in that program which digs you really deep into that process, which is hugely powerful. But just get a bit of paper. What's it costing you to stay in the guilt? Not really examining or facing the fears you need to face in order to shift the narrative. What's going to give you if you shift the narrative? Ultimately, my dear listener, it's your choice. Wallowing in the guilt is an option. That's up to you. Told you it was tough love. All right, let's get on to the good guilt. So good guilt. So good guilt's where you've got a value that you actually agree with. It feels right and true and wholesome for you. It's not, some disempowering bullshit. You've considered it and you've crossed it and you feel like shit. Well, good. Good that you do. Remember, it's a signal. I mean, some people say, I was kind of Googling, looking at keywords. It's one of the back end things you do with the podcast. Keywords on Google for search engine optimization. And there's some videos out there that never feel guilt again. How to never feel guilt. That's bollocks. I'm swearing a lot today. That's like never feeling pain. That's called leprosy. Never feel guilt again. That's not human. I mean, it requires to have either zero moral values, that's called being a psychopath, or to be superhuman and static, by the way, because, growth and evolution equals changing values. And we learn by these very mistakes. We might find something, we feel guilty about something. Hello, I've evolved. I would have been okay with that dodgy moral dilemma 10 years ago. Now it doesn't feel so good. Great. I've changed. That's a good thing. So, we grow because of them. So you feel like shit. You crossed your own values. Good, because that tells you it's time to course correct. You have to take some corrective action. So what does that look like? I mean, if you want to stop feeling guilty, that is, you can just hide it away. But we'll get on to that. So a lot of people do. Hide it away. Hide from it. But no, the way out is corrective action. That means making amends. That means making it right. So if, say you've done something like, you've done, like, stepped out of a relationship or something in a way that's not good. And you have an issue with that. Some people don't. Whatever. I have issues around people who don't. I own it. But, you feel guilty. Well, you're going to have to fess up, Oh, that's tough, isn't it? Or maybe you even just crossed your own boundary. You didn't you didn't speak up about the extra change you were given. Some people are fine with that. It's an abundance of the universe. I'm not here, actually, apart from the whole affair thing, I'm not here to judge your morals. And even that, you know what? There's usually underlying psychological reasons, all that stuff, which, if put in a place of willingness to look at it in the eye, then I'm cool with that. But let's say you've done that, you haven't fessed up to the change. It's time to take it back, turn around, you walk out the shop, it's in your pocket, that it's basically stealing. That's your value system. You've got extra change. They've overchanged you in the shop. Turn around. That's what the guilt is saying to you. Turn around, go back and say, oh, you know what? I just walked out. I don't know what I was thinking. It's not me. Here's the right change. You gave me the wrong change, So apologize and do better. Change. Commit to that change, depending on the scale of the thing that's making you feel guilty. And this is true whether it's you or another, because those examples kind of involve other people, making amends and making it right and confessing, all that kind of stuff. Generally other people. But, if it's you need to make amends to yourself. It's interesting, isn't it? If we've crossed our own boundaries to ourselves, again, it's that thing of going, how can I make this right? What do I need to do to make it right? And again, sometimes there are situations where, you can't necessarily speak to a person. Sometimes I hear people say, I've hung on to this guilt, but that person, say, passed on. Or it's just not viable to speak to them. I can't, they're not willing to even hear me say my piece. Well, ultimately, it's about you anyway, so you've got to ask yourself, what can you do to make it right with yourself? This is what the guilt, this good guilt, is telling you. You need to make some energetic, active correction in order for your system to come back into alignment, to put it right with yourself. So maybe you can pay it forward. And here's the thing, like I say, it's because people say, they won't hear my confession, so I can't ever forgive myself. Well, the burden's on you. It is on you. If you've transgressed a value, be it in the direction of another person or yourself, the burden's in of you. And speaking of the burden, by the way, here's where people get really stuck. Because what this requires, going back to just the simple thing of, you've pocketed the extra change and walked out the shop. That's a for some people that'd be terrifying, but relatively straightforward case of turn around right away, go back, give them the money, fess up. But in lots of more tricky relational issues, in lots of areas of life, and just for some people it's super scary, this is the burden, and this is where people get stuck, because it does require owning up. It does require that confession, and making it right can be hard. There's a lot of risks involved, right? There's the risk of humiliation, rejection, punishment even, But again, in a way, if I sort of talk more kind of, I guess, metaphysically, the burden's on your soul. We tend to feel it like ongoing guilt is like a sickness in the soul. At some point, it buries itself that deep, and it's on us to do something about it. And again, you've got to face those fears so that you can take the actions that you need to take in order to put it right. And often the actions you need to take for you is actually confessing, owning up to other people. And that's where we tend to sort of basically bullshit ourselves and start shifting the guilt into shame. When we back out, it'll be okay, it doesn't matter, that kind of stuff. Then, or we succumb to those fears. Oh, it doesn't matter, I won't go back, I won't put the money in. That starts to sort of shift that guilt into shame. And that's really not a good thing. I'm going to define the difference in a little bit, but what we basically do is we start packing the guilt away, and it starts to build up and become basically shame. And, I think, I can't remember who it was now. I wish I could quote the source, but I do remember hearing someone talk about how, and I do agree, it's been my experience, is out of shame, so many really toxic behaviors are born out of like this sense of shame. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So here's one of the things we do. It's part of the fear of how we back away from that, really taking on the burden of owning up, confessing, making it right, making amends. This is where good guilt gone bad. What we do is we shift the narrative in order to hide and protect ourselves. So let's say, you get in a fight with your lover, I don't know, your kid, a parent, whoever. Or maybe they kick off at you for something, right? Now, here's what we do. You conveniently delete your part of the equation and focus on their response. How dare they speak to me that way? That's outrage, right? That's a great defense. They've really gone off the rails. Ridicule them. Yeah, that's a good way to get out of owning your part. They're being so dramatic. Oh yeah, minimize them. Minimize their response and their behavior. Another form of ridicule. So dramatic. But here's the thing, in that interaction, you know what you did. You know why they're kicked off that way, in these kind of situations. Remember, this is talking about, this is where this is good guilt. You've been some part of that equation, but rather than admitting it, rather than taking on that burden, which is, by the way, the burden of empowerment and responsibility. That's what the burden is we're talking about here. That's what freedom and wholeness really looks like. It looks like humility. It's radical self-honesty. It's radical confession. In mastery, in the MPA mastery program, which, by the way, segue, promotional opportunity, Joel. You just mentioned mastery. Make sure you tell them about it. Radical confession, you see? I've just done it. We have a thing about radical confession in the mastery program, which is the MPA practitioners program. And which, by the way, all joking aside, is a friggin' fantastic program. We're just coming to the end of the first one that I've done. The next one starts in February 2022. Go to www.thempaacademy.com/MPA Mastery and check it out. If you're a coach, a change worker, practitioner in some kind of, we work with other people one-on-one or want to, check it out. It's amazing. Anyway, that's an aside. Where was I? Radical confession. That's what got me. Yeah. So in that program, we have a thing of radical confession, because part of the program it was relevant. Now I've got back to it. Part of the program is that we work through the practice work, and we do it in public. In other words, we do it in front of each other. So rather than me say, everyone go off into separate rooms, process with each other, come back and tell me what's and tell me how it went. I literally put them on the spot. We call them crucibles. So one person will be, in quotes, therapist, one person will be client. Go. And then they work on the technical stuff that I've been teaching them. And the radical confession comes in is I've got to hold that high standard and let them know what I see in truth, where it's good and where it's not so good, right? That's quite confrontational. But also everybody else is watching that, and we all learn so much from this. And when there's not all this kind of, I don't want to hurt their feelings, and and nobody learns shit. It's amazing, because everybody on that course is totally committed to it, and there's been this is what I see. And then it's like, wow, thank you. That really, and we all feel clean. And part of the whole program, I know I'm going about the program here, but it's relevant to this. Part of that thing of, through radical confession, owning up, saying the truth, we don't have that underlying sense of guilt that we haven't really said what's there. And one of the core things of that program is about, learning how to have zero agenda in the context of the therapeutic or, facilitation setting. And if you've got guilt hanging out, if you've got hiding hanging out, that's going to bring that into the equation. So let me bring it back. So good guilt gone bad is when you're unwilling to really face what is a challenge. And again, I'm always very kind of lighthearted about this stuff on this show. But again, remember, I'm not saying this isn't potentially really challenging stuff. But if you can laugh at yourself and go, am I gonna flake out on this one and just basically shoot myself in the foot? Or am I gonna suck it up and just dive in? Say it with a smile. You can bypass hours and hours of therapy, years of pain. Just laugh at yourself and just do it. So, where was I? Oh my goodness, I'm off on one today. So, you know what you did? That's what I was saying to you. Yeah, look at my notes. You know what you did. You know what kicked it off. That's the thing. So, let's say, your son or your daughter starts acting out. What's your part of that equation? Now, it's not about making toxic, crappy behavior okay, but the truth is, like, maybe what she's speaking to your daughter when she's kicking off is some of your behavior, right? Maybe you have been, not the best dad, or not the best mum in certain ways, so you can understand why she's kicking off. So it's not, it's that thing of going, I'm going to take my responsibility, because what's the alternative there? You defend, you make her wrong, you act like she's being stupid, too dramatic, or whatever. Underneath the surface, what's really going to happen there? Because you know that you've been part of the equation of this, you're going to feel more guilty, right? And then she's going to feel more confused, because then you're going to feel like you're a bad parent. It's going to cross your value system, and you're back in a loop. Rather than going, do you know what? I'm part of this. How can I make it right? Whole different thing. See, just saying that moves me. It's an amazing thing. And the thing about when you back out from that burden, as I say, is it will push it into shame. So let's have a quick look at, before we wrap this up, guilt versus shame. God, I properly rattled on there, didn't I? So guilt versus shame. So as we've established, the guilt bit relates to actions and behaviors. So that includes inactions, because often we feel guilty for things we haven't done as much as things we've done. So we've covered the guilt bit. So what is shame? How is shame different? Well, shame is different because shame is more about who you are as a person, kind of intrinsically. That's why I say when you start sort of pushing the guilt down and start to collect the weight of it, you're not willing to face that burden or deny it. It kind of builds up as it becomes part of who you are. You start to collect evidence of how, there's all this guilt there, and you start to feel shame, which is kind of a deeper, or I'd say it's a sense, it's got more to do with who you are. It starts to leak into your persona, which is why it can be so toxic to you. And ultimately, as I said, sometimes shame leaks out in the most toxic behaviors. So it's really about identification and kind of feeling bad, like I'm a bad person, unworthiness, those kind of things. That's the difference. That's where shame is. That's why, I say there's two kinds of guilt, good guilt and bad guilt. And basically, guilt is one of those things that if you just deal with it, take the actions that are required, or shift the narrative and then take the actions that are appropriate, which might just be dropping it and moving on with your life. Guilt's not such a big issue. It's a utilitarian. It's usable. So, but shame can be something that comes, by the way, it's not just necessarily about your actions. Shame can come more out of a lot of ongoing experiences like rejection. So ongoing rejection, humiliation, neglect, abuse, and various kinds of trauma can often give birth to shame. So that's the distinction, really. There's still a lot you can do about shame. I don't want to go into it here in depth. Maybe if that's something that you're interested in, I can explore that further in the new year. It's an interesting topic, but there is a difference, because often people confuse the two. When you're feeling shame, it's more about you. You're feeling guilt. This is the one we're talking about today. There's something you can do about it. You can take some action to move yourself out of it. So I hope that helps and makes a difference. So let's wrap this one up. So it's been some tough love. I've gone around the hills a bit. But twisted guilt sucks. It just sucks. But the thing is, what I want you to take away is only you get to twist it, right? I mentioned I'd say about the guilt trip. Well, the guilt trip. Let's think about that, right? The guilt trip is kind of a manipulation tactic, right? Someone tries to make you feel guilty, But here's the thing: if you're falling for a guilt trip, well, they only work on you if you're fuzzy on yourself, right? Check your values, check your boundaries, or if it's kind of good guilt, check if they have a point. Maybe they're trying to guilt trip, but maybe they're right. And it won't be a guilt trip; it will be a correction. It'll be bringing you into alignment. I remember the day that I told my mum, and I don't know, I can't remember if I said this in the introduction. I think a version of it I might have done. But basically, I was raised by a mum who said that the guilt trip was her favourite tool of choice. I remember the day I literally sat down with her and said, Mum, you can't guilt trip me anymore. And I absolutely meant it. I'd really got to the heart of it. She was a bit confused for a while. But don't bull yourself that it's don't bullshit yourself that it's their fault. You know, they're guilt tripping me. Oh, I'm so powerless. And don't give them the power. Now, again, coming back to the seriousness of manipulation. Now, I created Bulletproof and Boundary Bootcamp. Bulletproof is a program that goes deeply into manipulation tactics. Now, in the hands of an arch manipulator, if you're not ready for it, there are lots of techniques that can be very difficult to get your head around. When you know them, and the guilt trip isn't necessarily one of the main ones that I cover in there, but the principles are all the same there. If you have a hard time like dealing with other people's manipulations, the guilt trip being one of them, that's why I did Bulletproof, because it shows you what they're up to. It shows you what they're up to and how you can actually sort of head it off at the pass, like I'm talking to you about with the guilt trip. You know, you really understand, oh, that's what they're doing, because there's a difference. Like if it's not a good guilt trip, there's good guilt trips and bad guilt trips. The good guilt trip is they've got a point. The bad guilt trip is they've just got their agenda and they want to use the motivational aspect of guilt to get me to do what they want. But that's not true for me, you know. So I can understand how they're using various hook systems to manipulate me and to trigger that off in me. That's what Bulletproof does. And Bulletproof is actually a sort of taken part of the program, which is Boundary Bootcamp, because as I come back to the beginning, this whole issue of guilt is fundamentally a boundary issue. So Boundary Bootcamp really looks at looking at what works for you and what doesn't, which is the process that we've been talking about today. This is about values. Do these values work for me or don't they? It's kind of the same as, do these boundaries work for me or don't they? And if you're getting into the sticky territory, well, either come and see me one-on-one or the next best bit, and it will change your life. And by the way, if you bought it already, you know I'm talking to you. You've got to actually do the work. It's called a boot camp for a reason. It's a significant investment, but you're worth a significant investment. But it's not just the investment of the money, it's the investment of the time. Now, this isn't a very good sales pitch, I know, but I'm serious. It's like, I want people, it's being designed. I've put a lot of thought into that. Not that you care about that. But truly, the people that have genuinely gone through it, taken time to roll their sleeves up, do the work, follow the program, have had massive changes in their lives, all for the better. You can find those all at www.thempacademy.com and then go look at the products. If you want to know, you can go /bulletproof or /boundary-bootcamp. Those will get you there. And also, as I said earlier, there are lots of previous episodes. Now, other episodes related to this one include episode 109, which is where we talk about changing the narrative, and number 93, which was about feeling responsible versus caring. And the links to those will be in the show notes. Right, that's it for me, apart from one more thing, which is I have a crazy idea for next week as we come into Christmas week. And there's lots going on in my life. My girlfriend is moving in with me, beautiful Karen. She's moving in with me up here in Skipton on the 6th of January. So for Christmas week and January, I've got some ideas of what I'm going to do. So I can't tell you exactly what they are. But what I'm saying, why I'm raising it, is because I'm going to make it easy on myself in a otherwise very busy period. If I can pull off the Christmas week one, that'll be fun. And I'll give you a hint. It'll have my family in it. Now, if I don't pull it off, don't be disappointed. But I thought I'd give you that tease. And then the January one likely will be, I'll come back full swing after the move on the 6th of January, the following week. Will be something I put together from the past, but It probably won't be from the archive. It's going to be something else. Anyway, so there you've got that. So I won't be here in this fashion quite the same for a couple of weeks and into the new year. But I do hope to have episodes out for you to enjoy over the Christmas and New Year period. So until then, big hugs, and I'll speak to you soon. Thanks so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this show, I'd love you to do me a solid and tell someone about it. They can find us on Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, and most other podcast platforms. Plus, if you visit the website www.BABrillianthuman.com, you can share the show notes to social media and make my day. Also, make sure you hit that follow button, and if you haven't yet downloaded the MPA process sheet, head on over to joelyoungmpa.com and get your free copy today. Big love, and see you next time.